maybe we'll get started now. This talk will last for about an hour, maybe an hour and 5 minutes. I don't think it'll be any longer than that. John Duns Scotus was born in about 1266, 8 years before the death of Thomas Aquinas, whom he never met, and he died in 1308. Scotus was a Franciscan friar. Thomas was a Dominican. The Dominican theologians, when they were trying to demonstrate what is knowable to man through his natural reason, and without appeal to the claims of revelation, relied heavily on Aristotle, though without following him with their eyes closed. The Franciscan theologians charted a more independent course. Some of them were among the first to seriously call into question, with arguments, Aristotle's claim that whatever is in motion is, during the whole course of its motion, being moved along by something else. Scotus regards Aristotle's argument for a first unmoved mover as a weak argument. Both Thomas and Scotus wrote extensive and meticulously detailed commentaries on various Aristotelian texts. These thinkers and other scholastic theologians had a high regard for Aristotle, but Aristotle was not the final authority for them in matters of what can be naturally known without appeal to the claims of revelation. Final authority for them in this area was natural reason. The scholastics regarded Aristotle with great respect, of course, but not with piety. Their piety was focused elsewhere. Thomas and Scotus, like other scholastics, make a sharp distinction between what they think can be known about God on the basis of natural reason and what can be assented to only as a matter of faith. These thinkers are, to be sure, motivated to prove that God exists, and moreover, that his attributes are compatible with what is taught by the Catholic Church. But that they are so motivated does not, certainly not by itself, count against their arguments. A motive should not be misinterpreted as a premise. Euclid may have believed that the base angles of isosceles triangles were equal, and his belief may have motivated him to develop or search for a proof to that effect, but this motive does not invalidate his proof. We have to evaluate Euclid's proof in terms of its ultimate premises and its logical coherence. The same is true of the proofs of the existence of God that the medieval theologians developed. I mentioned this early on because one sometimes hears it asserted that we can disregard the proofs of the scholastics because, after all, these men, the men who developed them, were already believers. The assertion is based on a deep confusion, if not a shallow prejudice. The distinction between what motivates an argument and its actual premises is a distinction than which none is more elementary in logic. Of course, knowing that this or that thinker has an interest in proving the existence of God should certainly alert us to the possibility that his proof might make use of dubious assumptions or fall short of strict validity. But an interest in proving that God exists does not by itself invalidate a proof. Many more, by the way, than an interest in proving that God doesn't exist by itself invalidates a proof. Scotus' argument for the existence of God does not rely on Aristotelian physics or cosmology or any other theories derived from sense experience. It is, moreover, a modal argument. There are various kinds of modal arguments. The kind of modal argument that Scotus employs turns on distinctions between possibility, actuality, necessity, and their negations. Before returning to Scotus' argument, let us consider the following illustration of modal argumentation and counter-argumentation. Al-Ghazali, a medieval Muslim theologian who takes issue with the heterodox teachings of the Muslim philosophers, makes the following point, which, as some of you will recognize, reappears in modified form in the philosophy of Leibniz. The actual world, the world in which we live, is characterized by familiar features and regularities. But other worlds with different features and different regularities are logically possible. That is to say, there's nothing logically contradictory about the existence of a world like ours, but with, say, a different number of planets, a few more or less, or with different chemical elements, or with different species of plants and animals, or most simply, a world just like ours, but with left and right-hand directions, clockwise and counterclockwise, rotations, etc., reversed. If there's more than one logically possible world, then why, Al-Ghazali asked, is this world the actual one? Holding that its mere possibility cannot by itself be a sufficient reason for its actuality. Al-Ghazali infers that this world exists rather than any other possible worlds solely through the will of God, who freely chooses to make it the actual world than any other possible world that he could have actualized instead. Of course, one might respond to Al-Ghazali that this world is the actual world for no reason at all, but Al-Ghazali does not regard that as a rational response. Nor do two philosophers who take quite different stands on this issue. One of these is Spinoza, who claims that nothing could be other than it is, since whatever exists does so through the necessity of the divine nature, which because of its perfection also cannot be other than it is. Now, from this claim of Spinoza's, and others bound up with it, it follows that there are not a number of possible worlds as Al-Ghazali thought. The only possible world is this one. We erroneously think that there are other possible worlds because of the limits of our knowledge and the florid exuberances of our imagination. When we speak of other possible worlds in addition to this one, the actual world, we do not know what we are talking about, so Spinoza claims. Another thinker who takes issue with Al-Ghazali's argument is the 20th century analytic philosopher, and he is, I think, a philosopher, David Lewis. Lewis agrees with Al-Ghazali, or at least with Leibniz. Lewis may not have known much about Al-Ghazali, and Lewis disagrees with Spinoza. Lewis holds that there really are a number of possible worlds, indeed a vast number of them. But unlike Al-Ghazali and Leibniz, Lewis makes the startling claim that all possible worlds exist, as in really exist. Our world is the actual world only because, according to Lewis, it is the world that we inhabit. Lewis regards actual as an indexical term like here or now. Its meaning is relative to the speaker who uses it. It is easy to laugh at Lewis's thesis of the reality of all possible worlds, and many have done so. It's harder to refute that thesis than to laugh at it. In any event, whatever one makes of Lewis's thesis that there are a vast number of possible worlds, all equally real, though only one actual, namely the one that the speaker is in who happens to be speaking. We might have a counterpart in another world saying something, that would be the actual world for him. Whatever one makes of Lewis's thesis that there are a vast number of possible worlds, all equally real, and whatever one makes of Spinoza's thesis that there's only one possible world, namely this one, these two diametrically opposed and counterintuitive theses are testimony to the power of Al-Ghazali's argument. It can be countered rationally only by theses as extreme as Spinoza's and Lewis's. So much then for a brief illustration of modal argumentation. Scotus's modal argument for the existence of God is considerably more subtle than Al-Ghazali's. It is considerably more abstruse too, and it is extensive, occupying in his treatise on the first principle some 70 pages of tight reasoning. Scotus is inspired but not persuaded by Anselm's so-called ontological argument for the existence of God. He thinks that as it stands, Anselm's argument is logically unsound. In reflecting on how its logical defect could be remedied, Scotus makes use of an observation made by the great Muslim philosopher Avicenna, who lived before Anselm. Avicenna had argued that if it pertains to the very concept of something, that it is not the kind of thing that could be produced, then if it is nonetheless possible for that thing to exist, it must exist. For if it is possible for something to exist, but it is not the kind of thing that could be produced, that is produced by something else, then how else could this thing exist other than by necessity, that is, by virtue of its own nature, or as Scotus puts it, from itself, I say. To appreciate this observation of Avicenna's, it is worth returning to Spinoza, who of course lived centuries after both Avicenna and Scotus. Spinoza says, somewhat in the spirit of Avicenna, whom you may have read, of everything whatsoever a cause or reason must be assigned either for why it exists or why it does not exist. So if God does not exist, there must be a reason why he does not exist. Appropriating what Spinoza says and condensing somewhat, I group the reasons that can be given for why something does not exist into three categories. The thing in question has never been brought into existence or produced. For example, a skyscraper of a certain height, higher than any yet built. The thing in question has been removed from existence or destroyed, for example, a Tyrannosaurus Rex or the original World Trade Center. The thing in question cannot exist because it is a contradiction in terms, for example, a square circle. Spinoza thinks, and I agree, that these three reasons are exhaustive. If God does not exist, then it must be for one of these three reasons, there being no other reasons for non-existence than never brought into being, removed from being, and intrinsically at odds with being, that is, incapable of being because of contradiction in terms. Now, if God does not exist, could it be for the first reason, namely that he was never produced? Certainly not, because then God, construed as the greatest possible being, would have been to some degree inferior to whatever would have produced him, and hence not the greatest possible being after all. If God does not exist, could it be for the second reason, namely that he was destroyed? Certainly not, because then God, construed as the greatest possible being, would have been to some degree inferior to whatever would have destroyed him, and hence again not the greatest possible being after all. So if God, understood as the supreme being, does not exist, it can only be for the third reason, namely that the very concept of God, like that of a square circle, is a contradiction in terms. If God does not exist, then it can only be because it is logically impossible for him to exist, there being no other reason for why he would not exist. But then the following startling conclusion follows at once, like a lightning stroke. If it is possible for God to exist, then he must exist. God's possible existence entails his necessary existence. Now, this extrapolation from Anselm's argument will not be persuasive to those who do not think that a reason has to be given for why God does not exist. To those who say God just doesn't exist and that's that. The thinker who makes the most interesting case for not having to give reasons for the existence or non-existence of something is Heidegger. At the conclusion of his essay, some of you are familiar with it, Nietzsche's expression, God is dead, Heidegger puts it this way: thinking begins only when we've experienced the fact that reason, glorified for centuries, is the most stiff-necked adversary of thinking. Note that Heidegger's, so to speak, global rejection of arguments for the existence of God entails rejection of arguments against the existence of God as well, for they too appeal to the authority of reason. If you do not respect the authority of reason, if you agree with Luther that reason is a whore who will couple with anyone and anything for a price, or if you just think for whatever reason that reason has nothing to say about the deepest questions the human mind can consider, then there's not much in this talk for you. The express teaching of Aristotle and his great medieval followers, whatever their thoughts about God may have been, is that the principle of non-contradiction and its equivalent principles, such as the principle of the excluded middle and the principle of propositional identity, are self-evident. Perhaps you do not regard these principles as self-evident, but instead as only plausible hypotheses. Even so, you might still be interested in seeing where reasoning with them leads or does not lead, as an exercise in following the logos, to use Socratic language. Now, the argument that I've just summarized does not, I'm sure you noted, by itself purport to demonstrate that God exists, only that if it is possible for God to exist, then he must exist. If this is correct, and I for one do think it is correct, then everything turns on the question of whether it is possible for God to exist. Perhaps it is not possible for God to exist. Perhaps the concept of God, like that of a square circle, really does contain a contradiction. The great scholastics detected this unresolved issue in the core of Anselm's argument. Anselm seems to assume it's possible for God to exist. A number of modern critics of Anselm have honed in on this issue as well. Anselm, they say, assumes without sufficient warrant that it is possible for God to exist. They then move on to other things, unaware that Scotus set out precisely to remedy this defect in Anselm's argument. Scotus set out to demonstrate that it is possible for God to exist, according to the strictest criteria of possibility, from which he realized that God's necessary existence would follow at once. Before turning to Scotus's demonstration, let us consider an apparent result of the above reasoning. It could appear to put the atheist on the defensive, for the theist can argue as follows: it is not rational for you to say that God just doesn't exist, period. You must show that the existence of God is impossible. But unless you do that, you must concede that God's existence is possible. No? Once you've done that, you have to conclude also by virtue of the above reasoning that his existence is necessary and not just possible. Some theists might regard this argument as decisive. Scotus does not, for reasons we shall consider shortly. Now consider the following simple but quite ingenious reductio ad absurdum that Scotus advances. It will function as a lemma in his argument for the existence of God. I call it his compatibility proof. God, construed as the greatest possible being, must possess all pure perfections. A pure perfection, as understood by Scotus, is something that it is better, absolutely better to have than not to have. One might object that there is, or at least might be, I think this is on your handout, one might object that there is, or at least might be, an incompatibility between one or more pure perfections. So let us assume, for the sake of a reductio ad absurdum, that there are two incompatible pure perfections, call them A and B. Because A is a pure perfection, it is better to have A than not to have B. That's how we define our pure perfections. But our assumption is that A and B are incompatible. Having B would rule out having A. Therefore, in order to have A, which it is better to have than not have, it is better not to have B than to have B. But B, like A, is also a pure perfection. Therefore, it is better to have B than not to have B. Our assumption that there is an incompatibility between pure perfections, A and B, leads to the conclusion that it is both better to have B than not to have B, and that it is better not to have B than to have B. This is absurd. If A and B are both pure perfections, they cannot possibly be incompatible with each other. QED. Since we did not specify what perfections A and B were, we can generalize. No pure perfection is or can be incompatible with any other pure perfection. The claim that God does not exist because the pure perfections attributed to him are perhaps incompatible with each other cannot be sustained. If God does not exist, it cannot be for this reason. One might still insist that there are still, could be hidden somewhere in the concept of God, pure perfections that really are incompatible with each other. But this is just what Scotus's lemma, which is argued for entirely a priori and turned solely on the meaning of a pure perfection, has ruled out definitively. At this point, a theist might respond in the spirit and even the language of Descartes, God by definition is the sum of pure perfections. Scotus has just proved that there can be no incompatibility between pure perfections. So has he not proved thereby that no contradiction exists in the concept of God? And if Scotus has done that, has he not proved the possible existence of God and thereby the necessary existence of God as well, given the argument we considered earlier? Scotus's compatibility proof could appear to be game, set, and match in the theist's disputation with the atheist. For many a theist, if he knew about this, the proof would count as decisive. For Scotus, it does not. The very strength of Scotus's compatibility argument, its abstract character, leaves us in the dark as to what counts as a pure perfection. Is free choice a pure perfection? Is omniscience, including knowledge of what is trivial or vile, a pure perfection? Is taking an interest in the moral quality of the lives that human beings lead a pure perfection? These things do not seem to have been pure perfections for Aristotle, if he even thought in terms of pure perfections. In the Middle Ages, many of Aristotle's philosophical successors, though also arguing for the existence of God, did not think that these things were pure perfections. Moreover, Scotus's compatibility proof, relying as it does solely on the meaning of pure perfection, does not by itself establish that any pure perfections actually exist. It does establish that pure perfections, defined as what it is absolutely better to have than not to have, cannot be incompatible with one another. And establishing such a thing is impressive, but it does not by itself establish that there is an actual being who has or is these pure perfections, or even that there is a possible being who could be or have them. So the question now arises, how does Scotus understand possibility? He recognizes that there are different kinds. There is possibility in the sense of mere conceivability to us. Scotus thinks this is much too weak a conception of possibility to be serviceable for proof of the possible existence of God and thereby of his necessary existence. For one might conceive of something as possible, for example, a Euclidean triangle with only two of its angles equal, but with all its sides equal, only because one is not conceiving of it clearly enough to detect its impossibility. Similarly, one might conceive of something as impossible, only because one does not realize that what appears to be a contradiction can be satisfactorily resolved. For example, Scotus might say the Trinity. Whether the existence of God is conceivable to us or inconceivable to us, this might be simply due to deficiencies in our conceptual powers. Another sense of possibility can be called real possibility. Something is really possible if there actually exists something else that can, sooner or later, directly or indirectly, produce the thing in question. A skyscraper several feet higher than any that have yet been produced is really possible because it can be produced, and the same is true of many other things that have not been produced but could be produced later on. This richer sense of possibility, can be produced, is also of no use in the proof that Scotus wants. The existence of God is not really possible in this technical sense because there's nothing and no one able to produce him, not if he's construed as the supreme, greatest possible being. So in arguing for the existence of God, Scotus makes use of a third kind of possibility, not mere conceivability to us, and not real possibility in the sense of producible either, but what he calls formal possibility. By formal possibility, Scotus means that to which being is not repugnant, that which is not at odds with the nature of being itself. In saying that something is not repugnant to being, and that this something is thereby formally possible, Scotus means that it is related logically to what is. To take an example, this lectern exists. This lectern actually exists. As such, its existence is manifestly not repugnant to being. So Scotus infers that it is formally possible for a lectern to exist. Now, at first glance, this inference from actuality to formal possibility could seem to be about the most vacuous inference conceivable. But as we shall soon see, it is not vacuous at all. In the Posterior Analytics, Aristotle lays down several criteria for a demonstration. Scotus accepts these criteria. One criterion is that to know without qualification that something, call it X, to know without qualification that something, call it X, is the cause of something else, call it Y, we must know not only that X is indeed the cause of Y, but also, as Aristotle puts it, that the latter cannot be otherwise. What this means is that to demonstrate rigorously that X is the cause of Y, Y's existence or being the case must be a necessary truth. That at least is how demanding Scotus interprets this criterion of Aristotle's. Now here's the problem. If one's going to try to demonstrate rigorously that God is the cause of the world's existence, one must start with a necessary truth, according to Aristotle. But if it is a necessary truth that the world exists, then the world exists of necessity, its existence cannot be otherwise. And if this is the case, then either the world does not need a creator, since it exists of necessity on its own, or the world does need a creator, but this creator is not free in his creating of it. On the other hand, if it is only a contingent truth that the world exists, as Scotus thinks is in fact the case, then there appears to be no way of meeting Aristotle's exacting criterion that any strict demonstration, including a strict demonstration of the existence of the freely creating God, must be founded on a necessary truth. It looks as though Aristotle, simply by insisting at the level of logic that a strict demonstration of the proposition that X is the cause of Y requires the necessary existence of Y, has definitively ruled out a rigorous demonstration of a first efficient and free cause of the world. So what is Scotus to do? If the actual existence of the world is not a necessary truth, then where is Scotus to find the necessary truth that, according to Aristotle's criterion, must ground a demonstration properly so called? It looks as though 1.5 millennia before the high phase of Christian scholasticism, perhaps even in anticipation of thinkers resembling the Christian scholastics, Aristotle set up a roadblock with a sign on it reading, "You shall not pass." Before considering how Scotus meets Aristotle's challenge, let us take a look at the overall structure, not the strategy, that will become clear later, of Scotus's modal argument for the existence of God. The text in which Scotus develops his argument most extensively has been translated A Treatise on God as First Principle. But the Latin title, Tractatus de Primo Principio, says nothing about God. Aside from prayers for assurance occurring at the beginning of chapters of this work and a prayer at the end of the work, Scotus rarely speaks of the first principle in this treatise as God. He thereby answers a question that in some, mainly analytic quarters today, keeps Anselm's argument from getting off the runway. In the formulation, God is something than which a greater cannot be conceived, is the word God a name or a description or something else? Scotus's first principle is more a description than a name. Moreover, Scotus sidesteps quarrels or quibbles about what Anselm means in his formulation by greater than, along with more serious questions regarding what we can and cannot conceive about God. Scotus's argument, as it appears in the Tractatus, is divided into three parts: an introduction consisting of a recondite treatment of different kinds of causality, a lengthy section that establishes the existence and the relative properties of an unqualified first principle of the whole, what will later be called God. And three, another lengthy section that attempts to establish the absolute properties of this principle, this first principle. The relative properties pertain to the relationship between the first principle and everything else that is to the world. Scotus attempts to prove there that there is a first efficient cause, uncaused. He then attempts to prove that there is an ultimate final cause. He then attempts to prove that among beings there is a being that is preeminent, indeed unsurpassably great or perfect. After establishing that there's a principle that is first in the order of efficient causality, a principle that is first in the order of finality, and a principle that is first in the order of eminence, Scotus argues that these three are identical. There is one and only one first principle possessing the three relative properties of efficiency, first uncaused efficiency, ultimate finality, and absolute preeminence. Scotus then turns to the absolute, and those are all relative to us in the world. Scotus then turns to the absolute properties of the first principle, that is, those properties that the first principle would possess even if it had not produced anything, such as intellectuality, which for Scotus includes not only intellect in the narrow speculative sense, but will in the practical sense as well, and also infinity and simplicity or non-compositeness. In what follows, I shall focus primarily on Scotus's argument for first efficient cause. Okay, continue. Scotus's response to Aristotle, his argument is a posteriori. Scotus's argument is going to be that kind of argument. Unlike Anselm's argument, one of its premises is taken from experience. So here's the premise, the one a posteriori premise that his argument for first efficient cause rests on. Something is effected. Now, what in philosophy department shop talk is the epistemic character of this a posteriori proposition does not depend on any claims of natural science. It is rather self-evident. For if nothing else, I am incontestably aware that, and without the assistance of natural science, that sensations of various sort occur in me, often unexpectedly as the effect of things bumping into me, of temperature changes, sudden loud noises, bright lights, pleasant and unpleasant odors, and so forth. Even if I temporarily enter the mind of Descartes and call all these things that have an effect on me ideas, doubting for a while whether they exist outside my mind, doubting even that I have a body, still these so-called ideas are experienced as adventitious. That is, they're not experienced by me as innate to the very nature of my mind. That noise I heard out there just a second ago. Even if I go so far as to say these so-called ideas have me somehow as their sole source, I still experience them as effects. That is, as things or events brought about by something else. I do not experience such effects as brought about by themselves. Now, Scotus has an axiom. Whatever is formally possible, we talked about that a minute ago, whatever is formally possible is necessarily possible. To return to the example of the lectern, we can form a proposition, this lectern right here actually exists. If that is granted, then to repeat, I can infer that it is formally possible for a lectern to exist. That means, Scotus says, that though the proposition, this lectern actually exists, expresses a contingent truth, because he disagrees with Spinoza, the proposition inferred from it, it is formally possible for a lectern to exist, expresses a necessary truth. If you doubt the validity of this modal inference from the actual to the necessarily possible, you have to say that though you see with your own eyes, and hence grant that this lectern actually exists, you nonetheless think it might be impossible for such a thing as a lectern to exist. I grant you can say such a thing, but I don't think you can mean it. To return to Scotus's proposition, something is effected. From this proposition, contingent though it is, I can infer here it goes, the necessary proposition, it is formally possible for something to be effected. That something can be effected is a necessary truth. Even if the world had never existed, it would be a necessary and eternal truth that it is formally possible for something to be effected. This necessary truth was inferred, modally inferred, from the contingent truth that something is actually effected. Now Scotus has a premise for his argument that even Aristotle cannot dispute. It is necessarily possible for something to be effected. That's a truth that's not contingent. Now, excuse me. Moreover, it pertains to the very concept of an effect that it has a cause. So from the necessary truth, it is formally possible for something to be effected. We can immediately infer the equally necessary truth that it is formally possible for something to cause. This too is an eternal truth. It would be true even if there had never been a world, even if nothing had ever caused or been caused. These necessary and eternal truths Aristotle seems not to have considered. Now, there's nothing in the concept of cause or in the concept of effect that precludes an effect from itself being a cause, so a series of causes and effects is formally possible. We see them in the world. I'll give you some examples in just a minute. Scotus notes that causes and effects can be grouped into different kinds of possible series. He distinguishes between series of merely accidental causes and series of what he calls ordered causes. His eidetic analysis of different kinds of series can be illustrated by what we find in actual experience. Here's an example derived with modifications from Aristotle of an altogether accidental cause, a series of causes. A man walks to a swimming pool in order to go for a swim. He happens to meet a debtor once he gets to the swimming pool, and he collects the money he was owed. His walking to the swimming pool was not for the sake of collecting the money. The man's walking to the swimming pool was for the sake of a swim, let's say, and it contributed to causing, though only accidentally, the man to collect his debt. And his collecting the debt from the actual debtor could accidentally cause the debtor's wife to become angry. And her becoming angry could accidentally cause her to have a stroke. She did not become angry for the sake of having a stroke, and so forth. Accidental causes play no significant role in Scotus's argument for the existence of God. I mention them here only because he makes a distinction between accidental causes and ordered causes, and because he makes a different subordinate distinction within the sphere of ordered causes between series of causes that are accidentally ordered and series of causes that are essentially ordered. This distinction does play a role in Scotus's argument. By the way, on the back of your handout where you have that stuff that looks like it's material for a theology practicum, you might want to look at that. It might be useful. The classic example of a series of accidentally ordered causes, that's the horizontal sequence, is the series father, son, grandson. The father is the cause, or rather one cause of the son. He caused the son by begetting him. The son, in turn, is the cause of the grandson, whom he begot. In this second act of begetting, the son does not rely on the father's act of begetting. That is, the father is not begetting the son, while the son is begetting the grandson, whatever that would mean. The father's act of begetting is over and done with. So in a series of accidentally ordered causes, that horizontal sequence, the act of causing that is exercised by a posterior or later member of the series does not simultaneously rely on an act of causing exercised by a prior or earlier member of the series. Moreover, the members of this series of accidentally ordered causes are all of the same kind, namely men. No one of them is more a man than the other, and no one of them is more perfect in his act of causing than another. In this series of accidentally ordered causes, the individuals caused in the same way by begetting. And that's what I tried to illustrate in figure 1. You'll see why I put an A in the middle of that. Now, the case is different with a series of essentially ordered causes. For example, this pencil You can't see me, but you'll have to take my word for it. This pencil is producing, that is, causing marks on this piece of paper. It does so only because my hand is causing the pencil to move. In a series of essentially ordered causes, the lower member, the pencil, exercises its causality only because the higher member, the hand, is also exercising its causality at the same time. So in a series of essentially ordered causes, and that's your figure 2, all the causes are simultaneously at work, whereas in a series of accidentally ordered causes, the causes are at work only one after another. They're both ordered, but they're ordered in this different way. Moreover, in a series of essentially ordered causes, the higher causes are more perfect in their act of causing than are the lower causes. My hand is a more perfect cause qua cause, at least in this particular case of causing, than the pencil is. And what causes my hand to move is more perfect cause qua cause, at least in this particular act of causing, than is my hand. Now, what's causing my hand to move? We could call it my desire, but I have multiple desires, some of which are in conflict with each other. So I'm going to call what is moving my hand my will. Now, I hasten to add that I am not speaking here of free will or free choice. All I mean by will here is a power of moving or directing toward an end. It is conceivable that my will might be totally determined by temporally antecedent effects in a successive, accidentally ordered series of causes and effects. But I need a name for the highest cause that I can specify in the simultaneous, essentially ordered series that the writing example illustrates. If my use of the word will and what follows troubles you, then you may silently substitute desire or intellect or the intellect's apprehension of the apparent good. You may even substitute a cerebral event. I don't care. As you will soon see, nothing turns on what we say in the case of writing as causing my hand to move. I'm going to call it my will. Because in the writing example, my hand is causing the pencil to move and not the reverse, we can say that here in this particular series of essentially ordered causes, even if nowhere else at all, the hand is a higher cause than the pencil. It is higher up in the simultaneously occurring series of causes and effects. In fact, just a minute. So in figure 2, maybe this would help. If you imagine C as the movement of the pencil and D as the emergence of the marks on the paper, C would be the pencil moving, D would be the hand moving the pencil, and A would be the will, desire, whatever you want, moving the hand. Okay. Because a series of accidentally ordered causes, that's the figure 1, stretches back in time, and each member of the series is the same kind of thing, no member of the series way back in time has to be construed as having initiated the series. So Scotus agrees with Thomas Aquinas that the world cannot be demonstrated by natural reason to have had a beginning in time. It may have always been around. But the case is different with a series of essentially ordered causes. In the writing example, my pencil is making marks on the paper only because my hand is moving the pencil, and my hand is moving the pencil only because my will is moving my hand. And though there can be an infinite number of accidentally ordered individual causes stretching back in time, at least such a thing cannot be ruled out by natural reason, there cannot be an infinite number of essentially ordered individual causes operative at an instant, all exercising their causality straight downward through the series at an instant. As Scotus, who knew as Aristotle and Aristotle's Muslim philosophers exceptionally well, puts it, no philosopher has ever posited an infinity of causes essentially ordered, hence simultaneously acting. To return to the actual writing example, either my will is the first cause of that particular series and itself has no cause within the series, or something somewhere higher up in that series is immediately causing my will to move my hand, and thereby the pencil simultaneously. And that something higher up has no cause within the series. So right here in the actual world, there must be a first efficient cause, in the writing example, a first efficient cause of an essentially ordered series of causes. A first efficient cause is not itself the effect of something yet higher up in the essentially ordered series. But you might object. Here's your objection. But you might object. What is absolutely first in a simultaneous series of essentially ordered causes might also be but one member of a temporal series of causes and effects, accidentally ordered or merely accidental and extending infinitely backwards in time. That's what I tried to illustrate in figure 3. So I let A be my will, moving in the essentially ordered series, moving my hand, moving the pencil, bringing about the marks on the page, but maybe 5, I call that 5, an event within a temporally ordered, accidentally ordered series, which had 4 as its antecedent cause, and then before that 3, and before that 2, and so forth. So I haven't found, though I think there is in this world, something that's the top of an essentially ordered series. It could well be an effect earlier of something earlier in time, so it's not an absolutely uncaused cause. But there are 2 ways of responding to this objection, one elaborate and roundabout, and one that is considerably briefer. I'm going to present only the latter. The response consists of a brisk, eidetic analysis of the concept of cause. This is Scotus's. It does not pertain necessarily to the concept of an efficient cause that it be imperfect. I'm going to repeat that because it's important. It does not pertain necessarily to the concept of an efficient cause that it be imperfect. Any cause that can produce an effect only by virtue of itself being caused to do so by something else is imperfect or incomplete. And even if every cause that we encounter in the actual world is itself caused by something else, still it does not pertain to the very concept of an efficient cause that it be caused by something else. When we examine what is essential to the concept of a cause, we do find that producing an effect, or at least being able to produce an effect, does pertain to the very meaning of a cause. A cause that could not produce an effect would not be a cause. But we do not find that being itself produced, or even producible, pertains to the very meaning of an efficient cause. All that pertains to the concept of an efficient cause is that it is something that produces or can produce an effect. Therefore, an efficient cause, a cause that produces an effect without relying on either a simultaneously operative higher cause or a temporally prior cause, that is, an absolutely first efficient cause, is formally possible. But such a cause devoid of qua cause of any imperfection, a cause whose formal possibility has just been established, is something that according to its very concept cannot be produced. For if it were produced, it would not be an uncaused cause, nor would it be first either. Scotus now appeals to Avicenna's axiom. That's actually Scotus' own version of it. If it pertains to the very concept of something that it is not the kind of thing that could be produced, then if it is nevertheless possible for that thing to exist, it must exist, necessarily exists. So an absolutely first efficient cause is something that, according to its very concept, could not be produced, but also according to its very concept is possible. Therefore, first absolutely uncaused efficient cause exists of necessity. This necessarily existing first efficient cause Scotus does not call God, not yet. Having demonstrated the necessary existence of a first principle in the order of efficiency, Scotus proceeds to demonstrate the necessary existence of a first principle in the order of finality, and then a first principle in the order of eminence. I shall briefly sketch these demonstrations. Scotus borrows his argument for first principle in the order of finality or final causes from the second book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, although you might recognize something like this in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1. This is a brief reductio ad absurdum. If everything were desired, willed, chosen, or done for the sake of something else, that if everything were a means to further end, there would be no genuine end or final goal of activity. But if there were no genuine end, then there could be no means to an end either. There can no more be an actually infinite ascent in a series of final causes than there can be an actually infinite ascent in a series of essentially ordered causes. Aristotle says that such a thing would destroy practical reason. Therefore, there must be, Scotus concludes, an absolutely final cause, something that desired, willed, chosen, or done for its own sake, period. Note well that Scotus does not need to assume here that everything in nature operates teleologically. All he needs to assume here is that at least something can be done for an end. But that is not strictly speaking an assumption, it is a manifest fact. Take our writing example as an illustration. I write for the sake of an end, whether to communicate something to someone else, or to remind myself of something, or, as it was in fact the case, to make a point about Scotus's argument. When you think about it, it becomes apparent at once that virtually everything we do for the sake of an end. Of course, when we do something, as we tellingly say, by accident, such as slipping on ice and falling, that we do not do for the sake of an end. But everything we do on purpose, as we also tellingly say, we do for a purpose, that is, for the sake of an end. And that includes even little things like adjusting one's position in a chair, crossing one leg over another, and so forth. These things are done for the sake of getting more comfortable. We do not typically think about our doing these things for an end, but to the question, why did you just reposition yourself in your chair, you can give an answer, and it will take the form of, I did so in order to. If a scientist comes up with an elaborate neurological theory purporting to demonstrate that everything we do is just mechanistic, Scotus would say, and Aristotle would say as well, that he is committing the fallacy of explaining, indeed explaining away the more evident by appeal to the less evident. And furthermore, the scientist is even committing this fallacy, which you may not realize is a fallacy, for a purpose. He's aiming at understanding something adequately and communicating what he understands to others. In Husserlian language, such aiming is characteristic of the life world, the ultimate ground from which sciences like mathematical physics extract. Mathematical physics undertakes its abstractions from purposes for a purpose, namely in order to avoid positing purposes or final causes in nature. As a result of abstracting from purposes, modern mathematical physics is able to give a most impressive account of matter in motion, but is much less impressive in what it has to say about human action, though yet lots of assurances to the fact that one day it will be able to give an account of human action superior to anything we find in Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Kant, or Sophocles, Shakespeare, or Dostoevsky for that matter. The problem is that nothing, not even the whole nor even the tiniest part of mathematical physics, is more evident than the self-evident fact that everything we humans do deliberately, we do for a purpose. This is bedrock. It is as evident a principle of practical reason as the elementary laws of logic or principles of speculative reason. Back to Scotus's argument. In reflecting on the empirical fact that some things function as means for other things, that there can be a series of means and ends, then in such a series ends can function as means for a further end, and that this series cannot be actually infinite, Scotus concludes that there is something that does not function as a means for anything else. Up to this point, his argument is identical with Aristotle's. But here, Scotus gives Aristotle's argument, as we would now expect, a distinctly modal twist. It is formally possible for something to be done for a purpose. Writing. Since a series of means and ends cannot be actually infinite, it is formally possible for there to be an ultimate end, an end that is not a means for anything beyond or above it. After all, being a means for something hardly belongs to the very concept of an end. But such an ultimate end, an ultimate final cause, is not something that could be produced. As an end or purpose, it could hardly be produced accidentally or not for a purpose, nor could it be produced for a purpose. For then that purpose, and not the ultimate end itself, would be the genuine end, which is absurd. Since an ultimate end, an ultimate final cause, is formally possible, but not the kind of thing that can be produced, it exists of necessity. There is then not only a necessarily existing first principle in the order of efficiency, there's a necessarily existing first principle in the order of finality as well. Turning from efficiency and finality to eminence, Scotus notes that we find in the actual world something that is, at least in some respect and on at least one occasion, more perfect than something else. Consider the writing example again. In that particular act, my hand is more perfect in its causation than is the pencil. A human hand can cause a pencil to make highly intricate and elaborate motions. A pencil, not guided by a hand, cannot cause a human hand to make comparably intricate and elaborate motions, like playing the piano, for example. And my will is more perfect in its causation than either my hand or my pencil. My will can cause my desire, can cause my left hand and my right hand to move simultaneously, cause my right hand to write, or at least scribble, while at the same time causing my legs to move. I can take notes and I'm walking after a fashion. Note that Scotus is not claiming, nor does he need to claim, that a will is more perfect in every respect than a hand, or that a hand is more perfect in every respect than a pencil. All Scotus claims and needs to claim is that in certain particular situations occurring in the actual world, something is more perfect or functions more perfectly than something else. In fact, all Scotus needs to claim is that in one actual instance, such as our writing example, even if nowhere else in the actual world, not even in other instances of writing, but in one actual instance, something is more perfect in some respect than something else. I picked the writing example because it illustrates all three orders: efficiency, finality, and eminence. I could pick a richer example. Socrates is more perfect in his thinking than is Euthyphro. Achilles is more perfect in his running than is Hector, at least on that fateful day before the walls of Troy. Supplied with this finding from the actual world, that at least something is on one occasion actually more perfect than something else, Scotus moves modally and at once to the formally possible. Because something in the actual world is in some respect or other more perfect than something else, it is formally possible for something to be more perfect than something else. This too is a necessary truth. Now, to be less perfect than something else in some respect or other is clearly an imperfection. But imperfection hardly belongs to the concept of perfection. And that means that something that is not imperfect in any respect is formally possible. A supremely perfect being, or to say the same thing, a greatest possible being, is then formally possible. But obviously a greatest possible being is not the sort of thing that could be produced, for then it would be in some respect inferior to its producer. Therefore, since a greatest possible being is formally possible but cannot be produced, it exists of necessity. Here we should recall Scotus's incompatibility proof, which we considered earlier. I called it a lemma. There cannot be an incompatibility between two or more pure perfections. This compatibility proof did not establish the possible existence of a being that possesses these pure perfections, or even that there are pure perfections. It did show, however, that if there were an independent proof of the necessary existence of a first principle in the order of eminence, namely a supremely perfect being, an unsurpassably perfect being, the proof could not be objected to on the surmise that there just might be, perhaps somewhere unknown to us, an incompatibility lurking among pure perfections. That surmise, Scotus's incompatibility lemma, demonstrates is false. Pure perfections that it is absolutely better to have than not to have, are perfections that an unsurpassably perfect being would possess. Or more precisely, we can say it now, pure perfections, the kind of perfections that an unsurpassably perfect first principle does possess, necessarily. More about them shortly. Having demonstrated in three separate and independent proofs, and he could have begun with any one of these, the necessary existence of a first principle in the order of efficiency, a first principle in the order of finality, and a first principle in the order of eminence, Scotus proceeds to demonstrate that these are not three separate principles, but one only. If the principle that is first in the order of eminence were not also first in the order of efficiency and first in the order of finality, it would be surpassed in efficiency and finality by these latter two. But the first principle in the order of eminence has been demonstrated to be simply unsurpassable. It must then be both first in the order of eminence and first in the order of finality. And of course, it must then be first both in the order of efficiency and first in the order of finality. That's what the first principle in the order of eminence. And of course, if what is first in the order of eminence is identical both to what is first in the order of efficiency and to what is first in the order of finality, it follows that what is first in the order of efficiency and what is first in the order of finality are also identical. It is by arguing along these lines that Scotus establishes the identity of the three first principles. They are but one principle, and this one principle is first in eminence, efficiency, and finality. This first principle possesses, in comparison with everything else that exists or even can exist, a triple primacy. And so the first principle, which Scotus has demonstrated necessarily exists, is the absolutely first uncaused efficient cause. It is the ultimate final cause, that towards which everything that acts for an end is ultimately oriented, which does not itself act for an end or beyond itself, and it is absolutely unsurpassable, or the greatest possible being. However, I just used the expression, the absolutely first principle. Could there perhaps be more than one first principle? Scotus advances a number of arguments, some of them, as you can imagine, remarkably ingenious, to show that there cannot be more than one first principle. The simplest of these arguments, reductio ad absurdum, I reformulate as follows. God has been proved to exist of necessity. God is then a necessary being. Let us assume that there are two or more necessary beings, possessing the properties Scotus has demonstrated of his first principle. And let us call these, for the sake of the reductio, two necessary beings, A and B. You could call them two gods if you wanted to. Now, if A has no attribute that distinguishes it from B and vice versa, then A and B are not two necessary beings, but one only. So let X be an attribute that A has, but that B does not have. Now, if X is a contingent attribute that A just happens to have, an accident, not bound up with the very nature of A, then X is really distinct from the other attributes of A, and A is not simple, but composed. Composed in particular of what is necessary and what is not necessary. A's necessary attributes or properties and its contingent attribute could exist apart from each other, so taken as a whole, A is not necessary after all. As composed of what is necessary and what is non-necessary, A depends on a composer, which is to say, a cause. But if A is intrinsically necessary, then it is uncaused, indeed uncausable. So A and B, both hypothesized as necessary, cannot differ by virtue of possessing different contingent attributes. On the other hand, if X is the attribute by the possession of which A is presumed to differ from B, on the other hand, if X, the attribute by the possession of which A is presumed to differ from B, is a necessary attribute, a property, then A cannot exist without it, any more than it can exist without its other properties. But B, which does not have the property X, can exist without it. So A, which is hypothesized to differ from B solely by having the property X, should be able to exist without X as well. But that is not the case if X is indeed necessary for the existence of A. So A and B cannot differ by virtue of one of them possessing either a contingent attribute or a necessary attribute that the other one does not have. Hence, A and B cannot differ at all, but are identical. There is only one necessary being, and this is the first principle, which possesses the triple primacy of efficiency, finality, and eminence. Let us now call it at long last God. Two consequences of particular interest follow from this reasoning. If there is but one necessary being, then all other beings are contingent, and that includes matter. But to both be and be contingent is for Scotus to be caused. Accordingly, the very matter of the world exists only through the agency of the first principle. Matter is thereby created in the proper sense of the word. Matter, like everything else in the world, owes its being at every instant of its being to the agency of the first principle, even if it has, so to speak, coexisted with the first principle for all eternity. Matter is the creature, God is the creator. From the argument that there is only one necessary being, it also follows that God is the sole, ultimate, and absolutely first principle in every possible series of essentially ordered causes, regardless of how many of these series exist all at once or at different times in the history of the world. This also means that my earlier example of the moving pencil turns out to have been misleading, for I spoke as though my will were the first efficient cause there, uncaused within the series of essentially ordered causes that played a role in the appearing of the marks on the paper. But the preceding argument leads to the conclusion that God is the efficient cause of my will's efficacy in moving my hand. There's only one absolutely first efficient cause, and that is not my will, which is finite after all. And that means my will, even my will construed as free, owes its efficacy, though not necessarily its actual choices, to a higher efficient cause, that is, to the first principle. After having established the relative properties of God, the properties that pertain to how God relates himself to the world and us, Scotus proceeds to establish his absolute properties. These are the properties, indeed the pure perfections, that God has and would have had even if he had never created a world. That God has been demonstrated to be the first efficient cause and moreover unsurpassable in his perfection implies, according to Scotus, that he has intellect. It is more perfect, Scotus thinks this is self-evident, to know what one is doing than not to know what one is doing. And as the solely first efficient cause, God is doing quite a lot. So God has intellect, he knows what he's doing. And God also has will, which, to repeat, means simply the principle of acting proper to an intellectual or rational being. This claim, if you accept everything else Scotus has said, is not controversial. But what is controversial, and is the great, I think, the great controversy in the dispute between the medieval theologians and the medieval philosophers is the question not whether God as the first principle of the whole exists, whether God has free will. That is to say, whether God could do other than what he does. Scotus speaks to this question as follows. It has been proven that God is first in the order of eminence. His will is then perfect. Now it pertains to perfection of the will, that it will necessarily whatever is on a par with it or above it, in the case of wills other than God's will. God wills his own good, which is on a par with him necessarily. God couldn't choose to do otherwise. God could not will his own evil. And there's, of course, nothing above God for him to will. But it also, Scotus says, pertains to perfection of the will, that it will not necessarily but only contingently what is beneath it. A divine being that could not help but will what was beneath it would not be as perfect as a divine being who was free to do so or not do so. God as supremely perfect depends on nothing, needs nothing other than himself to be what he is. Therefore he does not need to create, creatures qua creatures being beneath him. Therefore he creates not of necessity, but freely. Score point for Jerusalem in that conflict with Athens. Scotus could have argued not just for God's intelligence, but for his omniscience as an immediate corollary to his argument for God's eminence. But he has an independent argument. It pertains to the perfection of God's will, that he can will anything that is neither contradictory nor in conflict with his own essence. In knowing what he wills and also in knowing what he could will instead, he knows everything that could follow from his willing. And that is everything that could be, all possible worlds, including every atom and every particular event of every possible world. And knowing everything that is or even could be, God is omniscient. Again, he knows every particle of every possible world. That's a lot. Whereas Scotus sometimes refers to this first principle as an efficient cause, he also speaks of it as an effective cause. Since God could exist without creating the world, his properly efficient causality with respect to the world does not pertain to his very essence. But his ability to freely create the world, or not create it for that matter, does pertain to God's very essence. And so in speaking of God's absolute properties, it is more proper to speak of his effective causality than his efficient causality. It is a matter of necessity that God can produce an effect. It is a matter of contingency that God does produce an effect. Because God's will is free, he can will more things than he actually does will. In fact, he can will an infinite number of things. And because of the perfection of his intellect, he knows what these things are that he could freely will. From this, Scotus infers that God's intellect is infinite, not extensively but intensively. His intellect exceeds any finite limit that could possibly be assigned to it. And Scotus argues that the same is true of God's will. God cannot, according to Scotus, who follows Thomas Aquinas on this, will what is impossible, and he cannot will what is incompatible with his own perfection, such as to take the popular example of creating a stone that even he can't lift up. God cannot do this sort of thing because he cannot irremediably limit his own power, and he cannot sin either. To those who worry that this means we can do something that even God cannot do, namely sin, Scotus would reply, get a grip. The ability to limit one's power irremediably and the ability to sin are imperfections of power, not perfections of it. Because all God's attributes are intensively infinite, again of such a nature that no finite limit is assignable to them, God himself is intensively infinite. He is the infinite being. Everything else, and that would be us, is finite being. Furthermore, God is simple in the medieval sense that he is not composed of parts. For as we noted a short while ago, if he were composed of parts, there would have to be a composer of him who thereby surpassed him, at least in that particular respect. But Scotus has already shown that God is unsurpassable in his perfection. God's attributes are, Scotus says, formally distinct. And here he disagrees with Thomas Aquinas, who says they're formally the same. Scotus says that the divine intellect and the divine will can be distinguished by us and by God as well. It's not, that distinction between intellect and will is not, as Thomas seems to have thought, just a distinction from our limited point of view. It's a distinction within God. God knows more than he can will, for some of the things he knows cannot coexist even through the agency of his will. For example, God, through his intellect, knows all that he could do in the future. But God cannot, through his will, do all that he could do in the future, for some of the different things God could do in the future are logically incompatible with other things he could do in the future. God could freely sustain the world in existence tomorrow, or he could freely annihilate it tomorrow. His intellect can know both of these possibilities, but his will cannot actualize both of them since they're incompatible. So Scotus says that God's intellect and his will are formally distinct, but they're not really distinct, a different formulation, because both being infinite, they cannot exist in separation from or apart from each other. There's no time and no place in the actual world or in any possible world to which God's intellect and his will do not both pertain according to the formally distinct character of each. If you wish to contest Scotus's argument, you can take one of several tacks. You can argue along Kantian lines that rational theology is impossible because of the intrinsic limitations of the human cognitive faculties. Or you can argue along Heideggerian lines that rational theology is impossible because of the intrinsic elusiveness of being. Or you can return to Avicenna and the other great philosophers of the Middle Ages and later on Spinoza and argue that the necessity of God's existence is incompatible with free choice, though you cannot reasonably do this without seriously engaging with Scotus's response, only a little bit of which we've considered today. What you cannot do in good conscience, I submit, is simply reiterate the groundless allegation that Scotus's argument and on the first principle, any more than Thomas's argument and on being in essence, logically depends on premises imported, overtly or covertly, from Aristotelian physics and or the claims of biblical revelation. Thank you.